Well, I got the picture.
Hey everyone, it's Press Any Button and we are back with another part of our Run and Gun series, and in today's part we're going to be learning how to indicate to our player which directions they are shooting in. Obviously we're able to shoot in all sorts of directions, but without showing it visually it kind of seems a little lame, so let's get that sorted. I'm going to give a demonstration of what I'm talking about and then we'll jump straight into the good stuff. So last time we got our character shooting forward and running, but did we get our character shooting backwards and running, and then forward and running, and then stopping, and then shooting backwards without me hitting the arrow keys, might I add, and then shooting diagonally, shooting down, shooting up, and then deciding to run into shooting forward again. And all of these things also done in the air. Did we do that? I don't think we did. So that's what we're going to work out today. So I've got Photoshop open here and I've just made a little chalkboard for you guys to show you what we'll actually be doing with each set of animations that we're creating. So we have up diagonal animations, we have forward shooting animations, down diagonal, down, and up shooting animations. Now this formula that we have really helps us to understand what's happening for each one of those animations, so we can regulate things so there's no weird variables happening here and there, and so everything works consistently. Now with the ground movement, we begin with the idle animation and we transition out of course into the running animation when the speed is greater than 0.2. We then have a shoot condition, and this shoot condition is going to be unique to each different shooting animation that we have. So once that condition becomes true, then we go into this running shooting animation. This is under the pretense that we are still going at a speed that is greater than 0.2. So we're going through this running animation, and while we are running we decide to shoot, and so we go into this shooting animation. Now if we stop running and our speed is less than 0.2, then we'll go into our idle shooting animation, assuming that we are still holding the shooting button. And then if we're not shooting at all and we've stopped because we're already in some kind of idle animation, then we'll go into our complete idle animation where we won't do anything. And the reverse works also. So if we're in our idle animation and our shoot condition becomes true, then we'll go into our shooting idle animation. If we then decide to start running with this animation occurring, then we'll go into the running shooting animation, and then if we stop shooting we'll go into the running animation and then the idle animation. And that's pretty much what we'll do for the ground movement. Then we'll revisit this little diagram for the rest of our movement. First things first, we got to get that backwards run that I demonstrated sorted. So how are we going to do that? Well, you're going to create a new animation clip and call it backwards run. You'll go to just legs, and I want you to copy all of the keyframes from just legs. So if you select the top nodes here and you'll select everything, hit Ctrl C and then go over to your backward run animation and hit Ctrl V. Then you're going to add a new property to this animation, and that's going to be spine bot rotation, or whatever you have as the parent bone for your entire character. This is because we're going to flip our character by accessing the rotation on this parent bone. So as you can see, I have a rotation of 180 degrees, which has completely flipped the animation. Now how do we get our backwards run animation working? Well, here's a little clue. If I play this animation backwards, what are you seeing? It's just the forwards run animation, but the keyframes are swapped around. So swap around all of the keyframes, so completely just flip the order of them, and you should be able to get a backwards run. Now that we've got that out of the way, we'll start off with one of our shooting animations. So I'm going to go for idle diag down, because I kind of like that. Just gives us a good representation of what's happening. So my character is shooting down right now. And what I could have done to save some time is I can just go to my idle forward animation, which already has our character shooting, and then we copy these nodes over we can paste them into that new one, and we've got most of the work done. But now what are we going to do? Well, one thing I neglected to actually discover before is that there's actually a record mode for our keyframes in Unity. So without doing a ton of work, what you can do is you can toggle this button so that it's set to red, and then click on whatever part of your character you want to move. So I'm going for, say, this arm bone, and make sure the timeline is at the place that you want that movement to happen. Move that. If I click away, you can see that that movement has been saved. So obviously you can see you can just rotate your character around to access all of these different angles without doing a ton of work. So if you've completed the animation, that'll be your first step done. And make sure you don't do anything with the legs in terms of the animation, because we are going to be accessing it for the running and the running back. So we don't want anything happening here because it's going to mess everything up potentially. So we'll go over to our character and we're going to access their script. So just go into their inspector and then edit script. And this will open up Visual Studio. Now we're in Visual Studio, so we're going to create some booleans for our new movement. I'm going to try to stop saying animation so much. So I create my boolean diag down equals false, so it correlates with the movement that we're doing. And then in void start, we're going to go to anim.setBall, and over here you can see that I've gone for diag down, which is a different spelling to how I've used it here, and it's in quotation marks, and then diag down as I've used it up there. So here we are accessing that boolean and we are assigning it to be used in the animator as diag down, uppercase on both words instead of camel case here. Now this part's a bit of a thinker. You're going to have to identify which keys you're going to be using for which movement. Because I'm shooting diagonally down, that's going to be the Z key and the C key. So let's go over to the Z key because that's the first one that comes up here. And we can see that a lot of the stuff is the same in the first if statement, but we've made a couple of differences. So we'll take that anim.setBall and we're going to set diag down to true anytime we're using the Z key. But then we're going to kind of contradict ourselves in these if statements and say, hey, but wait a second. If we're accessing the Z key and our player is facing right, then diag down is going to be false because they're not shooting forward and down. This is a moment where you'll want to take a look at your keyboard, and you could see that to shoot forward and down with the Z key, our character would have to be facing left, and to shoot forward and down when using the C key, our character would have to be facing right. So we've used facing right previously in our player movement script. So if we go over to our player movement script, you can see that I have facing right there. To access that, in the heading, we'll have player movement. So this is our player movement script, becomes pmove. And then in void awake, pmove equals object.getComponent player movement. So now we have access to whatever is in the player movement script, including the facing right boolean, which is awesome. So we know if our character is facing right, but they want to shoot left, then we're not going to allow them to access that animation that we just created. But if we go on, then we say if our character is facing left and the player hits the Z key, then they are going to access that animation because they are already facing left, and the Z key represents the left side of that diagonal down movement. This other bit that you see under here is something we'll be coming back to. And then just to make sure everything is unset when we're not getting that key down, we say else if input.getKeyUp, the same key code, we set every boolean to false that we've used in our animator. So that'll be the initial process that you go through with all of your animations, and I'm going to leave it for you guys to sort of navigate through it and just kind of get a feel for this whole system, because otherwise it's going to take ages for me to do it step by step with you. And once you've got that going, you'll want to go over to your parameters, create those new booleans just as you named them in the script, and then you're going to connect your main idle animation to the new idle animation that you made for shooting. So here we've got idle down, and what transitions do we connect it by? So in case you forgot, you just right click, make transition, it'll give you an arrow, click onto the box, and then vice versa for the transition coming back, right click, make transition, and then back to the other box. Now the transitions that we have here are diag down. So diag down is true, and that is, if you remember, the same boolean that we just created like 5 minutes ago. And if diag down is false, then we go back into our main animation. Now that we've said that if diag down is true, we go into this animation. Let's take a look at what can happen further. So now we have this diag down run animation. How are we going to sort out our run animation? Oh no, we're going to have to make more movements, aren't we? No, we're not, because we're done with this sort of movement tree here. All we had to do was make that one animation, and then the rest of it kind of sorts itself out. What we will do though is we'll use those layers again. So on this first base layer, I have, he says, I have idle diag down. On the shoot layer, I then have just legs. And remember, just legs is just the legs for running. So it's just a running cycle with just the legs. You could have these in either order, as you would be able to see if I went through each individual animation. So there's not too much of an issue there. And then we're going to make our transitions into our running main animation. So from our running main animation into our diag run, we're going to say, okay, if diag down is true, then we're going to transition into the diag down animation. So you'd make a transition over to that, and then you would make the transition as such. Diag down equals true. On the opposite side, we're going to have it as false. So we exit this animation and enter our running animation when diag down is false. So when we've met those conditions for diag down to be false, then we're going to go into our running animation. Our running animation simply goes back into our idle animation depending on speed, or we can go back into that shooting animation if we do start shooting again while running. Now bear with for a moment, because we're going to have a little bit of repetition now. Okay, we've created this forward shooting animation, but we want to also have an animation when our character is shooting backwards or strafing, right? How are we going to do that? Well, we'll just create an animation where our character flips round, but they do the same movement. So I go over to animation, and I have my diag down here. I create a new clip, and then I go and make it diag back. This is my diag back animation. It's completely the same as diag down. The only difference is I've again added a property, and that property is the parent bone for the entire skeleton of our character, and then I've rotated them by 180 on the y-axis. Can be minus, can be positive, doesn't really matter. It's just 180 degrees is 180 degrees. Doesn't matter if you do it clockwise, anti-clockwise, you're going to end up in the same place. Then it's going to be a lot of the same. We'll go back into our script, so let's go into Visual Studio. Now the first thing again is of course to make that initial boolean. So I've called this diag back. We could call it diag back down just to be more specific, but I already have diag back up, so I'm alright with what I've got here. We go into void start. We set it up with the animator, so in this line we have anim.setBall diag back, and then we go down into, let's look at Z again and see what we have to do here. Pretty much here, just do the opposite for what you did for the plain idle shooting animation. So the one where you were shooting forward, just do the complete opposite, and that will give you your diag back conditions. So when we are facing right and we hit the Z key, because my character wants to shoot left of them, then they're going to flip. So their animation will flip. That's not something we'll see as we shrink the transitions, but just to get it in our minds, the animation will flip. They will then shoot in that direction. However, if we're already facing left and we try to do that, then this diag back is going to be false, because we're not shooting back, we're shooting forward now in reference to how our player is facing. And then else if get key up, we set everything to false again to make sure that it's just left alone. Now I should have shown you what happens with C, and it'll be something that you may have suspected already. It's kind of like a parallel universe to what we had on the Z key. So when we're facing right, we want that shoot forwards to be true. So our diag down, our plain Jane shooting forward animation is going to be true. And our back animation is going to be false. When we are facing left, our shooting forward animation is not going to be true because our character is facing left, but we are telling them to shoot in the right direction. So what will be true is our diag back animation. And then again, else if we get that key up, so we release that key, everything becomes false again. And now we'll go back into Unity and see how we'll set those things up in the animator. What I should have mentioned before with the running animation is that you can simply just copy and paste this initial animation that you have. So Control C, Control V it somewhere. This is just going to pop up somewhere really inconvenient. But here it is, and then we can change the name of it to whatever. I'm glad that wasn't an expletive. And there you go, you've got your animation there. And in the base layer, it's going to have the same motion, which is really good. And then in the bottom layer, we're going to change the motion, as I will show you in a second. So I'll delete that a little bit. We've got our diag back animation, which will link to the idle main animation. And it's completely the same as setting up our other motion. Just got to get the idea that it's facing a different direction out of our heads. We are just doing the same thing with these animations. We got an animation where we shoot in a direction and we don't move, and then we connect it to an animation where we shoot in a direction and we move. We connect that one to the animation where we're not shooting and we move, and then we connect that one back to our animation where we're just chilling. So I would again make those transitions. So right click, make transition, drag it over to this diag back, or just like lead it over to the diag back, and then you'll have your transition arrow here. So I'm going to set diag back to equal true on this transition, and then I'll set diag back to equal false on this transition. As I've said quite a few times in this series before, make sure has exit time is not ticked, because our idle animation is super long. You're going to be like, yo, what's going on? Like, did I do something wrong? No, your character just wants to chill before they actually start shooting in any direction. And that's not what we want, so make sure has exit time is unchecked. We then go over to our diag back run animation. So as I said, you can just Control C, Control V this. You change the name in the top in the inspector here, and then go through the layers and see what you got. So we got diag back in the first layer. That's good, that's good, that's good. Then we look at the next layer and we have backwards run, and we just mix those animations and then we're sorted. We go into running main with the transition, and the transitions that we link these with are the speed, of course. So if the speed is less than 0.2, we go back to just diag back, so standing still and shooting backwards. And if it's greater, then we run and shoot backwards while running backwards, which is really cool. We go into our running main. If our diag back is false, so if we let go of the firing button, we go into running main. And if we hit the firing button, we go into diag back. And then again, back into the idle animation, but that's not something new that you'll have to set up. Now you can set up all the animations in that same way. Just remember these key principles. You have your idle animation and you have the reverse animation where your character is shooting backwards doing that same motion. And then you have your shooting running animation, which is a mixture of the idle version of the animation and then the legs that you want to use. If you're running forward, you're just going to use just legs. If you're running back, you're going to use backward run. The only exceptions are the X and W key. where we're only shooting up and down, so we don't really have to flick the direction. It's cool if our character just sort of does that depending on which arrow key you're hitting, because that's not too much of an issue. So you can see that I have idle up, so shoot up is true. It's completely the same. I have the motion in the base layer. Come on, Unity, work with me. Got the motion in the base layer. And then we have this condition. If it's greater than 0.2, we go into our running up animation. And this is just a mixture of just legs and that initial idle animation that we're branching off from, and you know the rest. So I'm just going to do a quick pass of the script so you guys have a decent idea of what's actually happening here. So just quick scroll, speed this up if you want. Now we're going to go over to this W key, and you can see it's very simple. If we're shooting up, then we're going to shoot in that direction, true. And if we let go, then that ball is going to be set to false. We've done the same with the X key, wherever it is. And you can see that it's really simple for these two, so it shouldn't be too much of an issue. What I'll do now is I'll just scroll through the rest of the script, so everyone has a pretty good idea of what's happening. By the rest of the script, I just mean this initial part, because we haven't set it up for the rest of our shots, which are the upgraded shots. So you can see that's how Q works, E works, all of these things. There might be a couple of discrepancies in what I've done, just in terms of setting the balls to true and false, but rest assured, just use the same strat that we established for C and Z, and you should be good to go. Now that we've established that what we'll be doing for all of our grounded animations, let's move into the good stuff, and that is the granddaddy, the jumping animations, the stuff that makes us look sick, like a Final Fantasy character or something. And to do this, we're going to open up the blackboard again and look at air movement. It's very simple this time, so it won't take too long. From any state, if our grounded boolean is false, and we know that becomes false when we jump, we enter a jump state. But for our more complicated animations, we're going to set up another parameter for that. So if some shoot condition is true, so if we are jumping and holding one of our shoot buttons, then we'll go into the jump state for that direction. And when grounded is true, we'll go into our idle animation, because the idle animation links us to all the other animations, so it's a good central point. You can see this really simple layout that we have here. It's just bam, 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 and the transitions are simple too. You'll be happy to know you don't have to go into Visual Studio anymore, because all of those conditions that you made for your different shooting directions will remain consistent whether you're on the ground or not. Remember, the only difference between us being in the air and being on the ground is that we have a boolean that tells us that we are off the ground and we can't jump again, and that's pretty much it. So let's reuse all that code, and let's reuse those animations too, which is the most important part. So when you begin, you're going to want to Control C, Control V your blend tree. This will give you the blend tree that you use for your jump animation, meaning that it's going to just transition smoothly and nicely no matter how many times you switch directions while you're in the air, because it will be the same animation acting in a certain part of our character, and that's going to be the legs. You'll then want to rename that animation in the inspector depending on what animation you're working on. And then in the shoot layer, you'll take the shooting animation that you'll want to be using. So let's use diag down again, just to keep things consistent. So in my shoot layer, I have idle diag down. And what is the transition tying these together? Well, I say if grounded is false and diag down is true, then we're going to go into jump diag down. But how can we be assured that all of this will occur if we're in the air? How can I make sure that it won't just go into some other animation, because we're using a couple of conditions here? And doesn't it have to branch off of something else? No, not at all, because we're using any state. So from any state, no matter which animation we are in, it's going to be most likely this animation. We're going to clip straight to this animation with this transition, because these two conditions are met. The fact that we are off the ground and that we are shooting in that direction. and we can make our final condition to take us into idle main, ground equals true, and that's simple enough. So I'll give you a demonstration of that. So Unity should mix your animations really nicely. I'm just going to keep holding this so you can really see what I'm doing here. And I've got a back animation, of course, and I did mention that we would clean up the transitions a little bit, but you can see that Unity's handling that all really well. In case there is some confusion, we're going to go into that jump diag back down. That is a mouthful, and I'll show you what you need to do for that. So it's just the opposite direction. As I said, doesn't really matter that it's the opposite direction. The only place where it matters is in our script. So we take the condition for it, which is diag back, and we make that true. We take the other condition, grounded equals false, and then we transition out with grounded equals true, right into the idle main animation. The one thing I'll say, if you find it's being a bit glitchy, Unity that is, with recognizing which animations take priority and stuff, just kind of like delete the motion going from your blend tree into the any state, and then hopefully things will work out. I found previously, if you use an animation with one condition and then you stack another condition on another animation, the motion with one condition is going to be prioritized instead of that new one that you've created that has two conditions. So just kind of like delete that, make your motion, test it out, and then add it back in. I found that works pretty well for me. How are we going to clean up these transitions now? So as I said, if you want to clean up these transitions, remember we had that kind of Paper Mario thing going on with our character flipping around. We can shrink them down. So let's go to our idle. We want a diag back. There we go. I'm going to go into the motion between running main and diag back run, because this is where that stuff sort of occurs. Shrink this transition right the way down, and then try to bring it over actually. So bring it to 100%. Come on, come on, come on. Oh, I had it for a second. There we go. Bring that to 100%. Bring this in here. You over there. And that should shrink down our transition significantly. So if I demo that. So that transition was from running into diag back. So yeah, just click straight into it. You can see when we transition back, we still have that Paper Mario thing going on. That's because we haven't done it for that particular transition. But that is it. That has been another Press Any Button tutorial. It's going to be a long one. I can already see how long it's taken to record this. But I hope it's helped you out a lot. Multi-directional shooting is a flashy thing. I just wanted to implement that as a little bit of an aesthetic choice, because I thought it'd be something interesting to get into. If you like this part, do the good stuff, like the video, comment what your favorite thing about video games is maybe, and most importantly, apply this stuff to your own projects, have fun with it, press on and keep creating.